Pearl Harbor, perhaps the most famous American military base in the world with a connection to World War II that most Americans are familiar with. What happened there on December 7th, 1941 helped galvanize a people and forge the story of a superpower. It was through defeat that President Roosevelt was able to guide his nation to victory. The question is, would the Americans have been so willing to send their boys into the jaws of battle if the attack on the US had been thwarted? This is the story of a young Air Force lieutenant who could have stopped the surprise attack and saved the fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. Kermit Tyler was a native of Long Beach, California, who joined the Army Air Corps in 1936. By 1941, the 28-year-old lieutenant was attached to the 78th Pursuit Squadron on the idyllic posting of Hawaii. It was really a fantastic place to be. Tyler would spend his time training in the latest tactics and on the best fighter the Air Corps had, the P-40 Warhawk. He lived in a beach house on the North Shore, which he shared with the future ace Charles H. McDonald. Now, if you want to know more about McDonald, he has an interesting connection with Charles Lindbergh, the Atlantic record holder, who was briefly attached to the 475th Fighter Group in 1944. Check out the video in the link above to find out more. During his time in Hawaii, Tyler would learn two new, distinctly different skills: how to surf and how to use a new aircraft detection technology, known to us as radar. Despite being a trained pilot, Tyler would find himself on an early morning shift helping the operators at the radar station at Opana on the very tip of Oahu Island. Radar, as it's universally known today, did not have the full confidence of the top American brass even in 1941. It was first demonstrated in 1935 by Robert Watt, a member of the British Met Office. However, its development has roots which go back as far as Heinrich Hertz in the late 19th century. After the successful demonstration of the system, the British government invested heavily in a defence system known as Chain Home, using the Radio Detection Finder technology, or RDF to the British. This system would eventually develop into what was coined the Dowding system. Ultimately, it was the ability of the British to detect German formations hundreds of miles away and then feed that information through a complex analysis and plotting system that gave them an edge in the summer of 1940. However, even by 1940, RDF had several flaws and limitations. The technology didn't give a clear indication of the height and number of aircraft it had detected. This information was provided as German formations crossed the coast by a countrywide team of aerial observers. Most of these were volunteers. Another issue that had to be overcome early on was the fact that RDF was unable to distinguish between the type and nationality of the inbound planes. This was solved by the British by a system called IFF, or Identification Friend or Foe. So by late 1940, the British had shown that early warning could be achieved by the use of RDF, or, as the Americans called it, radar. Yet, I have to think that at the time the British weren't broadcasting all the facts about their success with RDF. The Germans, who certainly knew about the radar installations around the coast of Britain, didn't understand the complexity of their use in the Dowding system. The Americans, then still a neutral power, probably didn't yet understand RDF's key role in the Battle of Britain either. This is why, even as late as December 1941, the radar stations around the islands of Hawaii were not being used as a defence method. Due to an underappreciation for the technology, there was a lack of trained operators and spare parts. This meant the units were only operated for a few hours a day between 4 and 7 AM. The focus was on training for an attack which was never expected to come, rather than actually monitoring the skies around the islands. In fact, the SCR-270Bs had been used in an exercise which was hauntingly similar to the events of December 7, 1941, and they had performed outstandingly. Hey guys, if you're enjoying the video and you think it's a story worth sharing, please do give it a like and help YouTube keep these stories alive. Let's get back to the story. So could the US have defended Pearl Harbor? The fact is, had the United States appreciated the vulnerability of the Hawaiian Islands and been forewarned of the impending attack, they would have been able to mount a better defence. Although most Americans would not have been aware of the imminent danger the Empire of Japan posed, there were enough in the government and military who were. A war warning was given on November 27th, mainly directed at US forces in the Philippines and on Guam. This would have been ample time to recall troops on leave and to coordinate a defense. In fact, Hawaii had been on Alert 2 level since even before the beginning of November. For me, the most poignant demonstration of the US's ability to have defended Pearl Harbor is the full-scale exercise that occurred for 7 days running up to the attack, ending on December 6th. Here, troops and anti-aircraft crews were fully mobilized, issued with live ammunition, and participated in simulated aerial attacks. Aircraft, which had previously been bunched together for protection against sabotage, were spread out across airfields in protected revetments. Radar was also used in the exercise and was able to demonstrate its use as an effective early warning device. The 6 SCR-270Bs being used on the island of Oahu had a range of at least 100 miles, which could have easily detected approaching aircraft 30 to 60 minutes before they crossed the coast. Unfortunately, the exercise ended at noon the day before the sneak attack. The ammunition was collected up and returned to storage to be locked up again for safety. Aircraft were also moved back to be parked closer together to make it easier for the guards to protect them against attempted Japanese sabotage. At 3 AM on the morning of December 7th, Lieutenant Tyler was driving to Fort Schaefer to start his shift as Air Corps liaison for the radar stations on the island. He would be responsible for anything that might happen between 4 and 8 AM, but didn't really think much would be going on. As he drove, he listened to the local radio station broadcasting Hawaiian music. 19-year-old Private Lockhart and 23-year-old Private Elliott Jr. were at the radar station on Opana, some 30 miles north of Fort Schaefer, and had turned on their units. Although Lockhart was the most experienced, neither man had any formal training with radar. Their experience with the SCR-270B they were operating was equally as poor, as it wasn't seen as a crucial piece of equipment. The radar station was only supposed to be active for 3 hours, and at 7 AM the two men were preparing to shut things down, but as the truck that was scheduled to collect them hadn't arrived, they decided to stick around to give Elliott some more time to practice operating the radar equipment. At 2 minutes past 7, Elliott's eyes popped at what he saw on the screen. A large blip 132 miles north of Oahu. Lockhart was surprised too, as it was the largest contact he had ever seen. So large, he initially thought the radar had malfunctioned. All they knew was that they were looking at a large plot of aircraft, but as the SCR-270B could not ascertain how many planes were there or whether they were Americans, they weren't too alarmed. It was unusual to say the least, but the pair hadn't been told about possible Japanese attacks, this being privy only to senior commanders. Nevertheless, the contact was so unusual that Elliott thought they should report it to the information centre. Lockhart laughed and told him he was crazy. After some prodding, he relented, and Elliott made the call. It wasn't until 7:20 that Elliott reached the centre's switchboard operator, a Private McDonald, and gave his report. A large number of planes coming in from the north. McDonald, who initially thought he was alone, passed the phone on to Lieutenant Tyler, who still had 1 hour of duty that morning. During the delay, the aircraft on the radar plot had flown 25 miles closer to Oahu. Despite Lockhart explaining that this was the biggest plot the men had ever seen, Tyler didn't seem overly concerned. He had recalled the music he heard while driving to work that morning. He knew that the radar station, KGMB, was asked to transmit late into the night, only when American heavy bombers flew in from the mainland. The radio transmission acted as a navigation aid for the ocean crossing. So Tyler, and quite understandably, thought that what the two privates were seeing was just that, a flight of American B-17s. He was half right, as a 12-aircraft formation was on its way to Hawaii, but that was not what was being seen. He told Lockhart not to worry about it, and decided against disturbing his superior, Major Berquist, who was at home. In the peacetime military, Tyler knew lieutenants didn't drag majors out of bed on a Sunday morning without a good reason. Tyler really had no inkling that this contact might be Japanese planes, because he too was unaware of Marshall's war warning from November 27th. In fact, from the news accounts he had read, he thought the United States' relationships with Japan had actually improved over the previous few weeks. Lockhart and Elliott continued to track the planes until 7:39, when they lost them 22 miles from Oahu once the island's topography interfered with the radar beam. Had Tyler given the radar operators the benefit of the doubt and risked an angry conversation with his superior, could he have prevented the Pearl Harbor attack? In all likelihood, no. Had the attack come just 24 hours earlier, then my answer would be very different. It makes me wonder, how good was the Japanese intelligence on the island? And how much was down to the luck of war? But that would be a story for another video. Despite the island of Oahu being pretty well defended and having 75 fighters, both P-40s and P-36 operational, America was still at peace. Men had been stood down after their full effort over the previous 7-day exercise. Less than 24 hours before the plot was noticed, less than a quarter of the island's strength was at readiness, and it would have taken some time to get the rest mobilised. But by 7:20, the Americans would have had 35 minutes warning. We could also argue that had the Americans reacted to other warning signs, of which there were many on that morning, the warning time would have been even longer. This may have, at the very least, given Army and Navy units at readiness time to arm themselves. It would have given the small number of aircraft standing at readiness the precious minutes needed to get off the ground. It only took pilots an hour to get organised enough to meet the second raid on the morning of the attack, and this is with many of the aircraft being destroyed on the ground. I think they may have been able to do a lot more in 30 or 20 minutes, if not reeling from a surprise attack. Of the few P-40s and P-36 that did try to get airborne that day, many would jump by zeros before they could get their speed and wheels up. Another very interesting point is that the Japanese pilots attacking Pearl Harbor were, honestly, as green, if not greener, than the Americans they targeted. Most of the Japanese aviators with real experience were still operating from Formosa, which is where I live now. Those who had destroyed the Chinese Air Force in the late 1930s had not qualified for carrier operations by 1941 and would not have been members of the attacking Kido Butai. Ultimately, the Zero pilots in the first wave had absolutely no combat experience at all, and may well have been overwhelmed by the more rugged American fighters lobbing 50 cal bullets at them. The fact that a handful of American fighters accounted for at least 11 Japanese aircraft indicates, to me at least, that a full force of 75 would have almost decimated the attacking bombers. If the Americans had been able to meet the first wave of bombers, which were escorted by a mere 43 Zeros, and given it a bloody nose, perhaps the second wave, like the third, would not have been launched. Ultimately, Lieutenant Tyler was not blamed at the time. He underwent a full investigation into his actions and was cleared of any wrongdoing. Acting on the information he had been given and his lack of knowledge of the impending Japanese attacks, he acted accordingly. History may disagree, but hindsight is always 20/20. Hey, if you found this an interesting video, please do give it a like because it really helps spread it to more people. And if you want to learn more about what happened during the Pearl Harbor attack, watch this video about Second Lieutenant Rasmussen, who fought that day in his pajamas.